Sometimes you load up a game because you want some huge story, some deep lore, maybe some emotional character arcs, all that stuff. And then sometimes you just want to turn off your brain and play with Legos. Sort of. Kinda. Well, today was one of those days for me. That was pretty much my experience with TerraTech Legion. I downloaded this game off Game Pass without really expecting much. I mean, it looked interesting enough. I figured I'd mess around with it for a bit, maybe do a run or two, see what it's about. And then somehow, a quick try turned into me sitting there way longer than I planned, gradually attaching blocks, more wheels, more nonsense onto this tiny little vehicle until I looked like some kind of post-apocalyptic Lego death machine. TerraTech Legion feels like one of those games that understands exactly what kind of fun it's going for. You can jump in, start things simple, enemies start swarming, and before long, you're completely locked in. You just think about one more run and how you can build something even dumber than last time. It's chaotic and surprisingly satisfying, and more than anything, it's just fun. So the basic setup here is pretty straightforward as far as roguelites go. Your drop down to alien planets is part of the TerraTech universe, where prospectors are sent out to gather resources, survive hostile environments, and build their way into something stronger. The story isn't exactly front and center here, but the premise gives you enough. You're out there harvesting, fighting off waves of enemies, and trying to survive long enough to become an absolute monster. So each run starts you off small. And I mean real small. You've got this dinky, basic little vehicle with limited weapons, limited mobility, and it's pretty simple, before it eventually snowballs. You destroy enemies and collect resources, eventually grabbing new blocks and weapons and upgrades, and gradually bolt them onto your machine piece by piece. With more guns come more armor, more utility, and weirder layouts depending on what drops and what you decide to build toward. And that's where the game really starts getting its claws into you, because by the time a run really gets going, that tiny starter vehicle can end up looking completely ridiculous in the best way possible. You're not just leveling stats in a menu, you're actually physically building your run as you go, and every new part changes how your machine handles fights or survives. That's probably the biggest thing that makes it stand out. A lot of roguelites are built around passive upgrades or ability stacking, but here, your progression is something you see happening in real time. You can actually see your run becoming stronger, messier, or completely over-engineered depending on how things unfold. And since each run throws different upgrade paths, weapon options, and build decisions at you, there's that constant temptation to experiment. You start asking yourself stuff like, what happens if I lean harder into mobility? Or what if I turn my vehicle into a tire centipede? Or what if I just stack machine guns in every direction? Can I survive if I turn into a death donut? Can I add a flying dual lightsaber that circles my vehicle like a death helicopter? The answer to all of that and more is yes. The building process is really the hook. It's not just surviving waves, it's surviving while slowly transforming into something completely ridiculous. But again, you don't start out that way. One thing TerraTech actually does pretty well is making you feel weak right out of the gate. Now, what do I mean by this? When a run starts, you're not just some massive war machine tearing through everything on screen. The power creep is gradual. You're rolling out there in this tiny little setup that honestly feels kind of awkward at first, with a dinky Lego gun strapped on your windshield wipers. No protection, and depending on who you pick, those first few minutes can absolutely feel like you're one bad decision away from getting swarmed. And I actually like that. This sense early on that you're working with scraps, holding on for dear life, just trying to survive long enough to start adding useful blocks, and slowly figuring out what kind of build this run is even going to become. Initially, your options are pretty limited, and enemies can start crowding you pretty quickly if you're not paying attention. But that's also what makes the progression hit harder later on. But, and I do mean but, once you've survived that shaky opening and your little rover starts evolving into something bigger, you really feel the difference. With more weapons stacked on, better wheels, or a creative structure, you can completely change how you move. Even just getting one solid early upgrade can suddenly make a run feel way more stable. I tend to appreciate a natural sense of escalation. You go from tiny guns to mechanized missile swarms, and well, the starting classes help with that too. Each one throws you into these early moments a little differently. Some feel more immediately comfortable, while others definitely make you think, alright, this could either go really well or I am completely fudged. So, Even before the crazier builds start kicking in, the opening minutes already start shaping how aggressive, careful, or experimental you're going to be. But none of that would be as good if the characters weren't unique in their own ways, particularly in their vehicles and upgrades. Once you move past the basic survive and build mindset, the actual pilots and their starter tech do a pretty solid job of changing how each run feels. You start out with Mikola, probably the easiest one for everyone to settle into early. Her playstyle is a bit more straightforward and forgiving, mainly because she eventually unlocks a stun ability that's really useful for the early game when you're getting swarmed. She also has pretty good reroll potential, which honestly makes those early runs feel less punishing when my build options weren't looking rough. She's obviously the way the game teaches new players how to play, mainly since she gives you a little more breathing room while you're still figuring out what weapons or block combinations really work. After your first few runs, you'll unlock Jean-Pierre. His vehicle felt completely different. He's way more about impact, durability, and just smashing straight through your problems. His ability gives him a recharging shield that initially takes a while to recharge, but through some of the meta progression, eventually gets much faster. He's basically the definition of the ultimate shield and has been my overall favorite for most of the game. Once that build starts getting bulkier, it really leans into that heavier playstyle, where ramming enemies can feel almost as satisfying as your weapons. Then you get Sam. His vehicle was a little weirder for me at first, but in a good way. His playstyle is focused on long range and critical hits, so lots of sniper rifles and edgy emo car parts. But you can still put whatever you want on the vehicle just in case. There was a little more intention behind how you move and position instead of just stacking bulk and hoping for the best. Definitely not the one I clicked with the fastest, but probably one of the more interesting ones once I started understanding what he actually wanted me to do. He's the speediest one too. And then there's Seafeed, or Safeed. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Honestly, this one surprised me the most. Her vehicle leaves a plasma trail behind it and can drift in almost any direction. It's a completely different kind of vehicle. It took me a minute, but once I started leaning into that mobility, it had some genuinely cool moments. She mostly uses elemental machines and drones to fly around your hovercraft. Definitely another technical character. What I like here is that these aren't just cosmetic picks. Your starter vehicle, your pilot abilities, even your early momentum can feel noticeably different depending on who you choose. So yeah, I definitely had favorites pretty quickly, and Jean-Pierre's brute force style was probably the one that clicked with me the fastest. But that's also what makes the roster work. It really feels like TerraTech Legion can give you a little bit of anything depending on what kind of run you actually want. So as I mentioned earlier, at first you're driving around in what basically feels like a barely functional little machine, trying not to get overwhelmed, picking up some scraps, and attaching whatever weapons or blocks you can find to actually try to survive long enough to earn. And then somewhere along the way, things just completely spiral. One run I remember, I started out fairly normal, just trying to stay balanced, adding a few extra guns, keeping my mobility fairly decent, not doing anything too crazy. And then I got a little confident. Suddenly, I'm stacking way more blocks than I probably should, bolting on extra weapons, widening the frame, adding more firepower, and before I knew it, I had created this gigantic rolling Frankenstein of a thing. You become a mobile base, shooting in every direction, covered in guns and engines and blocks sticking out in all directions. Your original design philosophy completely gone. At that point, it's completely up to you if you could still go for aesthetics, obviously. That visual progression is a huge part of why it works so well. You're not just watching numbers go up, you're literally seeing your machine evolve into something bigger, weirder, and it will probably tip over, to be honest, but that's also one of the game mechanics, by the way. Sometimes that ambition absolutely backfires. I had one run where I built this massive beast that looked unstoppable, but by the time I hit the boss, all that size started becoming its own problem. I thought I was invincible at that point. I had dual lightsabers sticking out the front of my rig, for God's sakes, but the bigger the machine, the bigger the hitbox as well, and I got humbled. I mean, it looked powerful, but the boss pretty quickly reminded me that large and terrifying does not always mean actually effective. That was probably one of the best parts of the whole experience though. TerraTech Legion really lets you build yourself into greatness or into a complete disaster. Now, for as chaotic and fun as the building gets, the game does a pretty solid job of eventually forcing you to prove whether your creation actually works. Regular enemy waves are one thing. Early on, they're mostly there just to push you towards different objectives on the map. You get swarms, ranged threats, you can find different resource nodes and bases, all manageable enough once your build starts stabilizing. My first few losses actually made the next successful run way more satisfying. That next time, I approached it differently. I paid more attention to structure, weapon placement, and not overcommitting to size just for the sake of looking cool. I mean, I still built big, obviously. Half the fun is becoming an absolute unit, but this time I did it a bit smarter. Better balance, faster, and I actually used my head this time around. And when the boss finally went down, it felt earned. Not in some deep story sense, because there really isn't much to it, just pure gameplay satisfaction. Like with any game, you're not just grinding runs. Well, I mean, you will at first, but gradually you'll learn how to build better, survive longer, and maybe, just maybe, not turn yourself into an oversized target. So yeah, the bosses definitely helped sell me on this more than I expected. They're not just there to end the stage. They're basically the game checking whether your ridiculous creation is actually brilliant. Or if you just wasted 20 minutes of your time. And that boss win is really where the game started sinking its teeth into me. Once I finally got through that wall and understood the kind of build choices that actually mattered, I kept wanting to go back in and push it even further. Not necessarily to beat it in some huge dramatic sense, but to see what kind of crazy ass machine I could create next. That ended up being a huge part of it. Some runs I'd lean harder into raw firepower and just try to cover the screen in bullets. Other times I'd end up experimenting with more structure, trying to build wider, faster, or just plain weirder to see if I could make something that looked completely unhinged, but somehow still worked. Also, quick tip, if you go to the corners of some of these maps, you'll eventually find special red circles that give you these corrupted parts. These can completely change your run. There's something weirdly satisfying about starting with this tiny little vehicle that looks like a baby's shopping cart, then gradually ending up with something that barely even resembles what you started with. Sometimes it's efficient, sometimes it can be a mess, but there's always that curiosity of, okay, what happens if I try this next, or this other thing? Unlocks definitely help too. Getting access to more options gives you that steady sense that future runs might open up in ways your earlier ones couldn't. But for me, the real thing was experimentation. I'd finish a run or fail one really badly, and instead of feeling done, I'd immediately start thinking about what I wanted to build differently next time around. Maybe less bulk, maybe faster speeds, maybe just some cool ass swords hovering around my machine. That's usually the sign for me that a game like this is doing something right. When losing doesn't just feel frustrating, it makes you want to take another shot with a dumber or smarter idea. Mostly dumber. That said, I can already see where this might not fully land for everyone. The early game can feel a little slow until you start building momentum. If someone jumps in expecting instant chaos, those first runs may feel simpler than they'd probably like, as you mostly start with adding spikes and basic guns. Visual clutter can also absolutely become a thing once your build gets huge and the screen starts filling with enemies, projectiles, blocks, effects, all at the same time. There were definitely moments where I had that "what exactly am I even looking at right now" problem. And while the building is easily the strongest part, I do think long-term variety is going to matter a lot. Right now, the fun is heavily tied to experimentation and seeing your builds evolve. But if someone doesn't enjoy that process as much, I could see the overall structure wearing thinner a lot faster. There's also the question of how much depth the progression really has over time. Since this is a smaller scale experience, that just one more run energy is doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Whether that holds for dozens and dozens of hours probably depends on how much you personally enjoy testing builds and messing around. So yeah, I'm having a genuinely good time with it, but I can also admit this probably won't hit for everyone the same way. If the building doesn't grab you, I think that'll make the biggest difference. So honestly, it's just way better than I initially gave it credit for. I think that's probably the biggest compliment I can give TerraTech Legion. This is one of those random Game Pass downloads I could have easily ignored, played once and never thought about it again. Instead, I got addicted to the quick runs. I just like that it knows what it is. It gives you a basic setup, throws you into danger, and lets you gradually turn that into something absurd. And while it's definitely not trying to be some massive story-driven masterpiece, it doesn't really need to be. Sometimes you really do just want a game that's fun to play and easy to jump into. Something that's satisfying enough to keep pulling you back when your last ridiculous machine explodes. So if you've got Game Pass already, I'd say it's a no-brainer to at least try. Either way, for a game I almost overlooked completely, I gotta say TerraTech Legion ended up being a pretty damn fun surprise. So if you played it already, definitely let me know what kind of insane builds you ended up making or how badly your first boss fight went, since mine definitely didn't go smoothly. And if you haven't tried it yet, but you got Game Pass, I'd say it's absolutely worth at least checking it out for yourself. It's also available on Steam, I'm pretty sure about that. And seriously, thank you to everyone for watching, commenting, and supporting the channel lately. We've been growing so fast, and I genuinely appreciate it. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like, subscribe, and stick around. I've definitely got plenty more gaming stuff coming. Thanks again, and I'll catch you all in the next one.